Shalom and welcome to Life Lessons. We are at number 10, Parshat Mikeitz, the story with Pharaoh's dreams and Joseph's interpretation, and the turnaround in Joseph's luck from being a slave, all of a sudden becoming the viceroy. But before that, an interesting story in a lesson that I've heard once. There was once a religious person. He was driving, and in his car he had his children. He was taking them to the day school, to the religious day school. He was in a rush a lot of times. Sometimes we're late to go to school, so he's in a rush. And here he's at a red light, and it's about to become green, but in front of him there's another car with a very slow driver. And this is the time where our patience get tested. And for a few minutes there, he forgot that maybe he was a religious person, and he was really swearing and yelling and screaming. But pulling up next to him was a cop. Without asking any questions, the cop looked in. He saw kids in the car. He pulled out the father and arrested him on the spot. Took him downtown to jail. Later on, when he comes up from his cell, and he tells him, "You're free to go." So he says, "Well, wait a second. What did you arrest me for? I never heard you arrest people for swearing and yelling. There's no such thing." He says, "That's not the reason why I arrested you." He says, "When I pulled up beside you, what I saw kids in the car. And I saw bumper stickers on your car that says, 'This car doesn't run on Shabbat, but on gas.' Another sticker that says, 'My kids are very proud yeshiva boys.' So that told me that whoever is the driver of this car must be a very religious person. When I heard you screaming and yelling and swearing, I was sure you kidnapped those kids. So that's the reason I arrested you." So in other words, we have to be, when we claim to be observant and religious, it really has to match it in everything that we do, or we better be very careful. So now we're talking about Joseph. And Joseph went through a test, and we see that. But what's important to speak about Joseph is about his belief in God. And what comes in here is not just his belief in God, but his trust in God. And that's a very important point. There's two things. There's to believe that God created the world. And then there is more than believing that God created the world, is that I trust in God that everything that's happening is God's plan. Now that demands much more. And if we go, even in the history here of America, you would find that this argument existed here in the United States early on, for the little research that I was able to look into. And that when you have the founding fathers, that quite a few of them were religious people, the question always is, how religious were they? Were they just religious that they believed that there's a creator? God created the world. That's quite a lot also to say, to demand from a person that God created the world. But here we are asked to go a step further, that not just God created the world, but to trust that everything is from God. So you could come and say, I believe that there was a creator, but that's it. Someone put on the engine, and the car is running. The world is running. So I believe that God created the world, but to say that every detail, big details, small details, everything comes from the Creator, that sometimes demands a lot from us. And there's an argument that not necessarily that everyone, especially early on, believed that way all the way. In other words, They believe that there is a creator. What I find very interesting is where it changes a little bit and becomes much clearer if we talk about American history, and then we'll talk about from a Jewish perspective, is in the letter that George Washington wrote about celebrating Thanksgiving. Over there, he writes very clearly because we should be grateful. This should be as of gratitude to the Almighty. When you talk that kind of language of being grateful, you're thanking God because He's involved in all the details. And because He's involved in the details, it was a very good year. We won the victory. The crops are doing very well. And you're attributing that not just to nature by itself, but you know from who the nature is coming. You know the nature comes from God, and God is involved in all the details. Now, just for a little bit to think a little bit about this, what is the difference if I just say I believe in God, I have faith in God, or I take it a step further and I say I have trust in God? It becomes very interesting difference. If I say I believe in God, sometimes it could make the believer could make a mistake and think that he's entitled from God to certain things, though he deserves certain things. Because what? I believe in God, but at the same time also, I'm entitled to many different things from the Almighty. If you want to take it a step further, any kinds of entitlement will fall into this category. However, when I say I trust in God, it's a whole different thing. It's not I'm looking, you know what, I am a believer and therefore I'm entitled. No. I thank God for every good thing that He has done for me. And even if sometimes things don't go right, even sometimes things go a little bit not okay the way it should, I still have trust in God. This is a very big difference. And it's very important because you could hear a lot of times people would say that they believe in God. But when they face challenges, they don't know how to deal with it. And they get very upset when things go wrong. Oh, I wanted it should be that way, it's not working this way, and things like, and vice versa. However, when we have trust in God, that's a whole different story. Then even what may not look so wonderful, however, I have trust in God that He has a plan. And in God's plan, it is part of the puzzle that eventually things will turn and be okay because that's His plan. I just have to be calm about it and follow God's ways, what He's doing. So this is a very big difference. There's a very big difference if I just say, I believe. Because if I say I believe in God, that does not stop me from my own doings to do things that are maybe a little bit different. There's a very interesting statement in the Talmud that says that a ganef, a thief, there's even such a thing. I don't know if I would call him a religious thief, but there's such a thing. Someone's a thief, and before he goes to do what he's doing, he's praying to God. Please, God, help me that I should be successful. It's a little hard to believe, but it's possible. He still believes in God, but he still would cheat somebody else. And he would even have a prayer, please, God, help me, I should be successful. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. 2 and 2 is 4, and somehow that doesn't make sense. However, if I just say believe does allow me, because belief could sometimes be superficial. I could believe in God, I could even attend synagogue, house of worship, and not necessarily day by day to do exactly what God wants from me. But when I have trust in God, that much more. This tells me that 24/7 I am relying on God. And that's a very important point. And this is exactly what's happening here with Joseph. And if we talk about in American history, it is important that this point was addressed at least by George Washington to add on this point to have also not just believe, but also trust. And that's the idea where you're being grateful. You are grateful to God for all the wonderful things. When it comes to us Jewish people in our belief, that's even more so. This is what in our prayers, the Birkat Hamazon, the prayers that we have after the meal, all these kinds of prayers bring out this point is that we are not just believing in God, we're also relying on all the details from Him. And that brings out a very interesting point here in the beginning of this parasha. This is Mikeitz, where it talks about the dreams of Pharaoh. We know Pharaoh had two dreams. So first, he sees that there is 7 fat cows, and then came 7 skinny ones, meager, and to his amazement, the meager ones ate up the fat, strong cows. And Pharaoh woke up. The dream repeats again, with Pharaoh seeing 7 stalks of wheat, healthy, looking good, and then next to them, 7 skinny ones and very meager. And then the meager ones, they're the ones that swallowed up the healthy looking stalks. And Pharaoh woke up. And if you could see from the language, it's like almost Pharaoh was frightened here. What's happening here? And we know that what Joseph came, Joseph gave the interpretation. There's going to be 7 good years, and then after that we'll follow with 7 years of hunger, and you should be smart about this. If you save now, there'll be plenty for later, as the portion here continues. But it's something very interesting in connection that we were saying about God. What frightened Pharaoh here is something very interesting. Pharaoh is like a lot of these rulers, a dictator. And in his book, the more power you have, then you're the ruler, you're in charge. To him, to hear such a thing, that a skinny cow is going to eat up a fat cow, that means that the weaker person, that something that's weak has the ability to overcome over something so strong and powerful. In his book, this doesn't exist. That's not what Pharaoh is all about. I am strong, I am powerful, I could go out there and conquer whoever I want to conquer, and that's what I'm about. More money, more land. The aggressor is the one in charge. And all of a sudden, that the weaker one should be in charge, that didn't make sense to him at all. And he was having a very hard time with it. So that's one point here. And the lesson here is very important, because as we know, the Jewish people that are going to end up being in Egypt very soon, under the rulership of Pharaoh, are eventually, and they're going to be a minority, and he or his successor is going to try to suppress them, enslave them. There is a very deep message here to Pharaoh, that he should know, not because you think you're powerful and you could do whatever you want, that therefore you will be able to win and automatically win over the weaker one. Not necessarily so. And that's a very important message to each one of us. A lot of times we think to ourselves, that you look around and you see, the way things are going in the world, let's say, it doesn't look good. So we forget for a minute that maybe God has a plan. And there's a reason why all these things are happening. And then you start thinking to yourself, it seems to me that the greedy one is winning, and all these kinds of complaints that we have all the time. So this is teaching us, no. In God's plan, not necessarily so. And that's the message. That's the message. It is possible for the skinny looking cows that they will eventually overpower. It all depends how we do things and how we connect ourselves to God's message. And this is what's important here. So that's one thing. Another important thing that comes out here, many times we could say to ourselves, especially when we talk about believe and trust. When I say I believe in God, for example, so I could go further and say, okay, maybe have a little bit trust that God takes care of all the big things. But when it comes to small things, like fat cows and meager cows, that's not God's department. He doesn't get involved in small details. Maybe he gets involved in the bigger details. You know, the famous joke that they say about husband and wife, that they asked once the husband, what's the success of your marriage? So the husband says, it's very simple. We divide it between ourselves. I take care of the bigger problems, and my wife takes care of the small problems. So, for example, he says, well, I take care if America is going to invade Russia or not. Take care of the bigger problems. My wife, she takes care about there should be food in the house, to take the kids to school, to make sure they do their homework, and then it's a happy marriage. I'm busy with all these big things, and she's taking care of the small things. So a lot of times we could think to ourselves that maybe the same thing is by God too. He's busy with the big things, deficits and who knows what, but the little things maybe not. We have to know that God is in the details. And these little details, that brings out even more our relationship with God, even more so. Because if we are not grateful for even those little things, that eventually could lead that I should stop praising God even for the big things. So the general picture is here when we read that story here is, and you think to yourself, oh, he's having a dream here about cows and about the wheat. No, these little things, these things that don't look so important, those are very important ideas that from that we could learn so much. So number one, that even the details becomes very important. And number two is what I was saying before is that what may look the weaker one, by who? By materialistic means, physical needs, is not so. Because if spiritually we are strong, we could overcome. And that's what's important. A very simple example to all this is, those are familiar a little bit, is the story of Hanukkah. In the story of Hanukkah, we see two important steps there. One, there was the victory of the war. The Greeks wanted to overpower Israel, and they did for quite a few years. And then the Maccabees fought back, and they overcame. That by itself is a huge story. A small army of the Jews won against the mighty power of the Greeks. So that by itself, it wasn't a simple story. However, we know that the main thing of the celebration of Hanukkah, besides this idea of the victory, is more on a miracle of oil that may look like a detail. That they came into the temple and they didn't have enough oil, and there was a miracle that it lasted for 8 days. A little jar that was only enough for one night, and here it was enough for 8 days. So you have two parts here in this story. What would seem you have major details, winning a victory of a war, and then you have a small detail, coming into the sanctuary, not enough oil. What do we celebrate Hanukkah for? The 8 days of Hanukkah is for the miracle of oil, because that brings out the point. Number one, it is the small details what's important. By the way, it's not such a small detail, the miracle of oil, but to some maybe they get lost in the military victory. And the other point is, it is that idea where there's not enough for one day and all of a sudden there's more, that brings out the story even more, because that gives us the idea to increase day after day. That is the story of Joseph. For example, in Kabbalah specifically, they connect a lot of time the idea of Joseph, that he's the same idea of Hanukkah. Many times, the time when we read this section is always around Hanukkah. Parshat Mikeitz, the 10th lesson of the book of Genesis, of Chumash Bereshit, in our calendar, because in our calendar it repeats every year the same thing. So it always comes out in that same time. So it has the same message, because Joseph, that comes from his parents' home, as we mentioned last time, away from his home, and it was very easy for him to give himself up, or to lose any, not only trust, even to lose belief. And we see he succeeded in those two things. Step number one, that is a necessity for each one of us to have belief in God. And that's not nothing. That's a very important foundation. But then comes the important step to trust God in every little detail. Now, Joseph, a lot of things in the Torah we see, they tell us a story, and they tell us why, because that's what they learned from that helped them change their outlook. In last week, by the end of in the last lesson, by the end of the section, we have an interesting story. When Joseph interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker, so he tells to the butler, here's the interpretation, but then he asks him a favor. But please remember me, because you're going to come out of here. And when you come out of here, you should do with me kindness, and please remind me to Pharaoh that I'm sitting here in jail for no reason. It's interesting how the section finishes off. It says exactly as Joseph said, that's what happened. The baker was hung, and the butler was returned to his post. The last verse, but the chief butler did not remember Joseph, and he forgot him. And then this lesson begins. After 2 years, Joseph was already 10 years in jail, and then how the butler forgot about him. This dream of Pharaoh was 2 years later. One of the commentators, the great commentators, Rashi, says to us something very important. He forgot him. The reason he forgot him is, there is the simple reason, here's a human being, and we see that he didn't care, that all the favors, the big favor that Joseph did for him, gave him an interpretation, a very good interpretation, and it was right, and he didn't remember to be graceful and to do a favor. But then Rashi says there's something else here. For a moment there, Joseph put his trust in a human being. And because he put his trust in a human being, therefore, God made it this way that he should forget, that the butler should forget. And there's a verse in the Psalms that says, praise is the person that puts all his hope on God, and the other way around, cursed is the person that trusts human beings and does not put his trust in God. If you look very carefully, the word again is his trust. We're not talking about believe. Joseph believed all the time in God. That was not a problem. But for 1 second there, instead of saying, may the butler be a good messenger from the Almighty. As a lot of times we go to doctors, and what do we say? We hope that the doctor is a good messenger from God. That point, this is for 1 second there that Joseph let go for a minute, so he got a good reminder. And a reminder that helped him for all the years to come. And now that had happened to Joseph, it does not have to happen to us, because we have a role model who to look up to. So in short, Joseph is teaching us a very important lesson. Not only to believe, but also to trust God, and not just on big details, but on small details too. And when we try to live our life that way, 24/7, in trusting God, no question, God will help us that we should continue to serve Him, and we should be successful in everything that we do.